Hey there, students and teachers. About a year ago, I recorded a video that I titled The Confederacy as Other. And in that video, I went into some things about the removal of Confederate monuments and specifically presented the Civil War and specifically the Confederate States of America in two ways. And not the whole dichotomy like, oh, was it about states' rights or was it about slavery? But more that it was either very simple or it was complex. And we can either view the Civil War and the Confederacy through a simple lens or a complex lens. And I've had some conversations since then with a lot of great people, including Coach Loftus, shout out. And I told him that I wanted to do a reaction video to this video on YouTube by PragerU or Prager University or whatever they're calling themselves. It's about as much of a university as Trump University. But this video here has been seen by about 2 million people, and it promises to explain the Civil War to us in 5 minutes or less. And so you can watch this video and all your thinking's been done for you. And you don't have to think about for yourself or consult any sources whether the Civil War was about slavery. Here you go. So anyway, I want to look at this video, and my point is not to fundamentally disagree with the premise of the video, or not to say that the Civil War was not about slavery or anything like that. But what I do want to do is warn you about when people are trying to show you how a very complex historical phenomenon was actually quite simple. The rhetorical strategies that they use and the selective evidence that they give you, these are things that may take a little bit more than 5 minutes to explain. So let's go on with the reaction, ladies and gentlemen.
Was the American Civil War fought because of slavery? More than 150 years later, this remains a controversial question.
Now, let's take a look first. We see this gentleman in a military uniform. So, of course, since he's in uniform, he must be believable. Also, we see Prager University, whatever that is, good luck applying to that place. But then we see that he is the head of the Department of History at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Now, so we are putting his credentials together. This is somebody you don't have to question. This is someone you can believe. Now, also, the uniform is dark. Dark colors tend to be more believable than light colors. So if you're thinking about the kind of clothing that you want to wear, I'm wearing a dark blue shirt. It makes me more believable. We'll see. So let's go ahead and see what he has to say.
Why? Because many people don't want to believe that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution. There has to be another reason, we are told. Well, there isn't.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, he's going ahead and telling us before he presents us with any evidence, well, there isn't, okay? There has to be another reason. This has to be a little bit more complex than a Confederate soldier waking up in the morning and thinking, hey, how can I preserve slavery? But he's already telling us before he gives us a shred of evidence that, well, there isn't. Let's see what he has to say.
The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Slavery was, by a wide margin, the single most important cause of the Civil War.
Wow, that was a really creepy sound. Did y'all hear that? It was like, wow. It was almost like somebody's lightsaber lit up or something. And so the word slavery, which is in this like violent kind of red-orange, all of a sudden comes up in all caps. Now, of course, people communicate through letters and fonts and all that. That's why I hate Comic Sans so much, because it really doesn't communicate anything of any seriousness. But we see here that we've got all of these other causes that are, just in the background in little kind of muted colors, and then all of a sudden, all caps, slavery. All right. So using visual animations in order to drive home this point, again, before any evidence has been presented.
For both sides. Before the presidential election of 1860, a South Carolina newspaper warned that the issue before the country was the extinction of slavery, and called on all who were not prepared to surrender the institution to act. Shortly after Abraham Lincoln.
Now, as far as his use of evidence here, anybody who knows anything about the Civil War or the Confederacy or the antebellum South knows that the Charleston Mercury was the most radical paper in the South at the time. It's in South Carolina. It was published by Robert Barnwell Rhett. And this guy, I'm not saying that the Charleston Mercury is not a valid source, but if you're going to present one piece of evidence, note that he went for the most radical. The Charleston Mercury actually criticized the Confederate government a great deal because the Confederate government wouldn't reopen the slave trade. So that's the type of individual we're dealing with that really didn't even stand in the mainstream of Confederate opinion, was seen as a radical even by Confederate standards. So it's very important when somebody puts evidence in front of you that you think about, why was this evidence selected rather than something else or from another paper or something like that. This was selected specifically because it was the most radical paper in the South.
Victory, they did. The secession documents of every Southern state made clear, crystal clear, that they were leaving the Union in order to protect their peculiar institution of slavery.
Now, this is another thing that we have to think about when we consider things historically. He says every Southern state. All right. Now, what we have to remember is that the Confederacy only had 7 states initially. And yes, you can look at the Mississippi Declaration of Secession, and they say right off that we are seceding because of slavery. They don't make any ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not very complicated. But does that necessarily describe all of them? There were some states like Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia that initially rejected secession, and they didn't secede from the Union until after President Abraham Lincoln called for troops for an army to invade the Confederacy. And so to say that every Southern state put this in their secession documents is not true.
A phrase that at the time meant the thing special to them. The vote to secede was 169-0 in South Carolina, 166-7 in Texas, 84-15 in Mississippi. In no Southern state was the vote close. Alexander Stephens.
Whoa. Let's back up here. Okay. In no Southern state was the vote close. Now, notice he did not show Georgia, which had a very healthy debate. Now, it was still about 2/3 voting to secede, but at the same time, it was a closer vote than any of them that are being shown here. He's also not showing Virginia's vote, which Virginia, even round 2, being an upper South state, it was a close vote. Now, this I want to look at, the 69-1 Arkansas. Shout out to Arkansas High School, Amy, Claire, and Maddie, and all of those other great people. But Arkansas initially rejected secession. When they had their first secession convention, they rejected secession, and then after Lincoln called for troops, they reconvened, and then they seceded. Now, this is dishonest to put the state of Arkansas like this and to show that, oh yeah, it was nearly unanimous in Arkansas, when we have here a state that initially rejected secession. And so this oversimplification of the Civil War is exactly why people are beating each other up and running over each other with cars and all of this crazy stuff, okay? I mean, this is dishonest.
Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the Confederacy's vice president, clearly articulated the views of the South in March 1861. Our new government, he said, was founded on slavery. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, submission to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition.
Now, first of all, let's look at how Alexander Stephens is portrayed here. Of course, faceless. His tie is red. Who wore a red tie back then? But he's portrayed here as scary as possible. Now, this cornerstone speech, it is a valid historical source. Now, the other side of this, though, is that Alexander Stephens of Georgia actually he argued against secession at the Georgia Secession Convention. So this is somebody who believed that secession was unnecessary, and then after secession, and it was inevitable, and he's the Confederate vice president, now he's rallying people based on their race fears. Now, the other thing here is that when we see this rhetoric of, racial subjugation, Abraham Lincoln used the same rhetoric in 1858 during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. As far as racial subordination and white nationalism, Lincoln was saying the same thing. Now, granted, Lincoln was not defending slavery as the natural and normal condition for African Americans. That he was not doing. But what we're seeing here, again, my point is not to fundamentally disagree with this video as much as to point out the lack of nuance and the dishonest use of selective evidence to try to cast the Confederacy in as terrible of a light as is possible.
Yet despite the evidence, many continue to argue that other factors superseded slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Some argue that the South only wanted to protect states' rights. But this raises an obvious question. The states' rights to what?
He has a point there, okay? Now, again, I'm not disputing that slavery, was, this is what people are arguing about the whole time leading up to the Civil War and a major cause of Southern secession. Now, the problem I see here is this whole dichotomy of slavery and states' rights, okay? The debates about slavery were very key to the American Civil War, but another thing to consider is that the Northern and Southern political class could not agree on what the Union was, that those people who had seceded, the Southern politicians who defended secession, they truly thought that what they were doing was legal and it was in line with their view of the United States as a compact, the Constitution is a compact between sovereign states. So as far as that goes, now the other thing I want to note is that he begins building a straw man here because he characterizes anyone who believes that anything except what he's saying is that they're saying, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it's about states' rights. So just to note that. Let's continue.
Wasn't it to maintain and spread slavery? Moreover, states' rights was not an exclusive Southern issue. All the states, North and South, sought to protect their rights. Sometimes they petitioned the federal government. Sometimes they quarreled with each other. In fact, Mississippians complained that New York had too strong a concept of states' rights because it would not allow Delta planters to bring their slaves to Manhattan. The South was preoccupied with states' rights because it was preoccupied first and foremost with retaining slavery.
Now, of course, at the same time, none of the examples given here necessarily matter as far as the central issue here being the whole states' rights philosophy. And one of the key components of the states' rights philosophy at the time was a state's right to secede from the Union. And while true, states like Wisconsin and New York and plenty of other states, they had their laws that they passed to try to challenge the federal government with the Fugitive Slave Act. It still does not address the fundamental disagreement between the North and the South as to whether a state had a right or not to secede from the Union legally.
Some argue that the cause of the war was economic. The North was industrial and the South agrarian. And so, the two lived in such economically different societies that they could no longer stay together. Not true.
Oh, wow, he just told us it's not true, so it must not be true.
In the middle of the 19th century, both North and South were agrarian societies. In fact, the North produced far more food crops than did the South.
Whoa. Okay, so check this out. What happened to all the factories? All right, the factories, they're just gone. Now, one thing is, if we want to look at Kansas or Illinois or something like that, and we want to put some corn there was certainly agriculture in the North and a lot of corn growing, a lot of wheat growing. But when we look over at New England, and there's an ear of corn in New England as if the New England economy is based on corn. Now, again, the factories are all gone as if actually, the economic argument, which has some merit now, just because we put a bunch of corn icons on there, that is not a good argument anymore. So just be careful of what people are pushing on you with animation, because there were factories in the North, especially in the Northeast. This idea that the North and the South had not developed different economies, that it's just like, oh, we just got cotton and tobacco and corn. Come on, this is horrible.
But northern farmers had to pay their farmhands, who were free to come and go as they pleased, while southern plantation owners exploited slaves over whom they had total control.
Now, that is a well-dressed farmer. You notice this? Like, this guy, gosh, I mean, he's got his top hat and his tie and all of that stuff. That's interesting. Now, of course, this totally sidestepped the issue of how were northern factory workers treated during this time, which was really one of the big issues of back and forth between the North and the South. And we've just pretty much just passed that whole thing over by putting some corn on there and this farmer in a top hat, paying this blue guy to work for him.
And it wasn't just plantation owners who supported slavery. The slave society was embraced by all classes in the South. The rich had multiple motivations for wanting to maintain slavery, but so did the poor, non-slaveholding whites. The peculiar institution ensured that they did not fall to the bottom rung of the social ladder. That's why another argument that the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery because so few people owned slaves has little merit.
Now, sure, this thing about the Southern social ladder is, I don't see anything to disagree with, but remember that we are sidestepping that African Americans were typically not allowed to vote in the North. In some states, such as Abraham Lincoln's home state of Illinois, African Americans couldn't even get into the state. A free black man could not go into the state legally. So as far as that goes, you've certainly got something here about the social ladder, but then this kind of passes over, racism and white nationalism and racial hierarchy being part of the national history of the United States and not something that is peculiar to the South.
Finally, many have argued that President Abraham Lincoln fought the war to keep the Union together, not to end slavery. That was true at the outset of the war, but he did so with the clear knowledge that keeping the Union together meant either spreading slavery to all the states, an unacceptable solution, or vanquishing it altogether. In a famous campaign speech in 1858, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What was it that divided the country? It was slavery and only slavery.
All right, so now we've got Blue Lincoln here. Now, one thing I want to note here is when Lincoln gave the House Divided speech, didn't have a beard, okay? He didn't grow that till like 1860. So whoever's doing this, Blue Lincoln should have been clean shaven, first of all. Now, second of all, the House Divided speech is being quoted, which this was a campaign speech. When we think about our POV, context, audience, and purpose, when we're looking at historical documents, Lincoln at the time was running for Senate in the state of Illinois, and he was trying to persuade voters that, slavery could be brought up here if you don't vote for me. Now, if we look at Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he's speaking as president, Lincoln claims very fervently that he has no intention to do anything about slavery in the South or anywhere where it is. He states his non-opposition to the Corwin Amendment, which was an amendment that passed both houses of Congress that would have protected slavery, in the states where it existed. So the North went out of its way to try to persuade the South that, slavery in the South is not threatened. And so as far as this goes, I think that it is dishonest to look at a campaign speech that Lincoln made when he was running for Senate and not Lincoln's pronouncements as president, where he's saying different things. We have to take into account the context. And then we see here, what was it that divided the country? Slavery and only slavery, which again, he's pushing something here which takes away any of the nuance about the different economies in the North and the South, the different values, the legitimate disputes over the right of a state to secede. So what we're doing here, what he's doing is he's trying to push this thing at you that this is so uncomplicated that you can swallow this hook, line, and sinker, and that the American Civil War is not a complex historical phenomenon that is worthy of further study.
He continued, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln's view never changed, and as the war progressed, the moral component, ending slavery, became more and more fixed in his mind. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law. Slavery is the great shame of America's history.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Let's go back here. Okay, now this guy is the chairman of the history department at West Point, and he's presenting the Emancipation Proclamation as a document that freed all slaves. All right, we just pick a few words off of this, and my God, like, this is completely dishonest. All right, this is... He knows what he's doing, all right? The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in Confederate-held territories. Now, I'm not telling you that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free a single slave, because surely, as the Union Army advanced, slaves were freed, okay? Booker T. Washington wrote about in his book Up From Slavery that, he remembered when the Union soldiers came to his plantation and read the Emancipation Proclamation. But the idea that the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in Kentucky or Tennessee or Southeast Louisiana or Tidewater, Virginia, where the Union was, or Delaware or Maryland, this is not true. This is a mischaracterization. I would say an intentional mischaracterization of this document to give the Union more moral high ground than it deserves. Now, am I saying that the Union did not deserve any moral high ground? That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that let's not romanticize this whole thing into a Michael Scott version of the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln once said, if you are a racist, I will attack you with the North. This kind of view, as much as I love Michael Scott, when it comes to history, the Michael Scott version of history is not something that I would recommend being taught to our children. And this is just, there aren't words for this gross misrepresentation of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I, at this point, can say that this is dishonest. This is a lie. PragerU, whatever you are, pun intended, you should take this video down. All right, this, come on now. Let's see what the rest of it has to say.
Shame of America's history. No one denies that. But it's to America's everlasting credit that it fought the most devastating war in its history in order to abolish slavery. As a soldier, I am proud that the United States Army, my army, defeated the Confederates. In its finest hour, soldiers wearing this blue uniform, almost 200,000 of them former slaves themselves, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America. I'm Colonel Ty Seidule.
Wow, so let's not mention how they raped and burned and pillaged and all of these other things that they did, in Sherman's March and in other cases. But we see really the picture here, and this is something that I want to address in all seriousness because, as far as this gentleman, he wants to feel good about himself and about his role and about his army. Now, you can hear me talk. I mean, I'm obviously a descendant of Confederate veterans, all right? So, certainly my point of view is colored by, where I come from and, my home and my ancestry. But at the same time, that is, giving yourself this validating feeling is not a justification for misrepresenting things, for oversimplifying things, and for, discrediting things that are valid in order to make yourself feel better. That's not what history is. History is an inquiry into the past. And the more complex and the deeper that inquiry gets, the more you realize that this can't be explained in a simple video of this sort in 5 minutes. And this sort of thing is poison. And that is my assessment of it. Not because none of the arguments that it makes, have any merit, because some of them do. But it is presenting it in such a way to try to discourage further discussion, to try to discourage critical thought, and to try to turn people against each other rather than to try to create an honest dialogue, which that is what history is about at its best. So as far as that goes, again, my objective here is not to say that the Civil War is not about slavery, but just to note that anyone who's trying to oversimplify the Civil War is typically using very selective evidence and in a lot of cases misrepresenting, things in order to try to get you to think like they do. And, all of the straw men that are created here, the misinformation, don't fall for this stuff. Do your own research. Consult the primary sources and come to your own conclusions. And remember that the more you look into these things, the more complex they tend to be. Let me know what you think about this video in the comments. I'm tempted to do some more videos on the American Civil War. At some point, I would like to narrate the whole thing through. I understand that it's a controversial topic, but I would like to give my take. Remember, again, leave a comment. Let me know what you want to see in the future. And it is always a pleasure.